Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Salam and welcome. Today, not just salam, but also, I guess, namaskar and sat sri akal, because we've got a fantastic panel with a bunch of friends and colleagues and people that I admire from next door, from India. And of course, India's gone through this really important and very grand exercise of its general election, and it's thrown up a really surprising, at least for some people, result. Among those people is myself, and having been surprised, having been taken in by the opinion polls and exit polls that preceded this result, I've spent the last 5, 6, 7, 8 days trying to understand what happened. And I thought that instead of doing this one-on-one with some of these really very deeply experienced and well-regarded friends from India, we would do this as part of our series of policy roundtables. So with no further ado, let me quickly introduce to our viewers this fantastic panel. We're joined by DCA Raghavan, former ambassador of the Republic of India to the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, among many other ambassadorial and diplomatic assignments over a long career. Raghavan, it's great to have you and to see you, even though it's far away. We're also joined by Seema Chishti. She's the editor of The Wire. This is one of those great publications that's emerged over the last decade in India, along with the print and several others, as India evolves from traditional media to new media, and also evolves from traditional India to this new India that we've known for the last decade. And I mean, one of the questions there that I'll have is how she and others see the evolution of the media in India with this result and what it means for the media. We're also, speaking of the media, joined by the fantastic Suhasini Haidar. Suhasini has been a diplomatic correspondent for a long, long time, and currently, I think it's been a decade now that she's been with the Hindu. And of course, we all read Suhasini sort of regularly, not just to learn about India-Pakistan issues, but really India's place on the global stage. And few others capture the sort of essence of that story over the last several years as Suhasini has. And last but definitely not least, Aakar Patel. Aakar is I guess, a former journalist. Maybe you're never really a former journalist, but certainly somebody well known to people that write in the entire region, and also a human rights activist, most recently as the India chair of Amnesty International. So welcome to publisher, journalist, Renaissance man, and human rights activist Aakar Patel. Let's just, I mean, everybody knows what's happened in the election. Aakar, part of one of, the kind of worries that I tend to have is that when everybody in my circle, or kind of this, what we call this bubble, we all have these bubbles that we've curated. At least in my bubble, it seems that everyone's really excited and really happy about this election result. That means I don't have as many friends in the BJP as maybe I should, or maybe it means something else. I don't know quite what it means, but the assumption that this is a good thing for India and for the world, how well-founded is that assumption, if indeed that assumption is at any operating level something that you also feel? I guess my challenge to anybody that feels like this is a good thing as well, India's done better in the last 10 years than it's ever done before in terms of its economy, in terms of its global standing. So why then would a weaker Modi translate into a stronger India? Aakar?
I think that to come to the second part of what you said, it is questionable whether the last decade was one that India saw the highest growth. We were the only country to degrow in 2020-2021. For 9 quarters from January 2018 to March 2020, the onset of COVID, the rate of GDP growth contracted. One of the problems we've had is that the government has been fairly efficient at undermining its own data. So it threw away a survey in 2018 that showed that consumption was lower in 2018 that year than it was in 2012. It discredited a government survey that showed that unemployment in 2019 was the highest since data began to be collected in 1971. It has not done the census for the first time since 1881, something that we've done through the Second World War in 1941, something that we've done through the global pandemic of 1921, still not done. It hasn't released, last point, the civil registry of deaths for 2021 for fear, I think, that it will show that the toll of COVID-19's second wave in India was very high, and tens of lakhs of more people died than was thought to be the case. So I would put the data to one side and say we are not doing as well as the world might say we are doing. Why it's a good thing? I would say there are three ways of looking at it. The first is, do a large number of people think it's a good thing? I would suggest that the answer to that is yes. And the way I look at it is, exit polls and opinion polls in India have generally had a reasonably good track record. That they have been off sometimes, but they haven't been off fully. It's very unusual, as we saw this time, to have 12 opinion polls and about 9 exit polls all showing the direction wrong. What could be that reason? One reason could be that they're all fixed and people are trying to make money out of the stock market. Possible. The other is that they have their science completely wrong. That is also possible. What is also possible and perhaps likely, I think, is that people were lying to the person coming to collect the data for fear that they didn't want to reveal what it was that they felt and how they would vote. That's the first reason. The second reason, I think, that we've gone through in these 10 years a period of fairly authoritarian, that's a word I would use, a rule, where the cabinet hasn't been consulted on major decisions like demonetization when more than 85% of the currency was scrapped, or the national lockdown. One person took that decision and that was communicated to the cabinet on the day it happened with the rest of us. The third thing I would say is that there is an impulse in the BJP because it calls itself an ideological party. That impulse is to persecute minorities. It shows in two ways. One is through exclusion. So we have had 3 sets of Lok Sabha MPs from the BJP since 2014, of whom none is a Muslim. The BJP has about 90 Rajya Sabha MPs, of whom none is a Muslim. It has 1,000 local legislators, of whom there is one Muslim. So total exclusion of the sort. Even the Congress did not practice when Jinnah called it a Hindu party. That will remain with the BJP. But the second part of the persecution, which is the laws, persecuting Muslims through the criminalization of the possession of beef, criminalizing Muslim divorce, banning interfaith marriage, ghettoizing Muslims in the state of Gujarat by law, all of that, I think, will slow down a bit. So for these reasons, I think it's a good thing.
That, obviously as a Pakistani and having sort of 4 grandparents, all of whom were born and raised in India, and 2 parents, both of whom were born in India, some of this stuff kind of appeals at a visceral level for me personally. But stepping away from myself and my own identity, maybe Raghavan, I want to come to you on the international dimension, but I want to start with Seema Chishti. Seema, the reporting around this election has been mixed, I would say. In some cases, we've seen some really fantastic analysis. I think Rajdeep Sardesai had even tweeted about Syed Kamran, who had got UP right when everybody else had got it wrong. And a lot of the attribution of those who were able to do the analysis correctly in the run-up and in the days around the election versus a lot of the opinion polls is being attributed to some sort of ideological divide. Whereas I think, listening to Aakar, there might also just be sort of technical differences. What is the sort of root of why so many people got this wrong? And is it more than just like technically bad journalism or technically bad pollstering? Is there more to this that goes beyond rent seeking, that has to do with political ideology and with extremism?
So if I could say all of the above, I would say that. that it's really been like, I mean, media has been in a huge crisis, I think, which everybody knows. I think the region has been in a bad way, but particularly India, and the World Press Freedom Index has put India at 159 of 180 countries and all. So that means that there's been tremendous stress on the media for reasons of the economy, for technology, for technological reasons. They felt badgered and obliged to kind of support governments. And there's been tremendous pressure exercised by a very powerful executive government, which had an absolute majority, 2 terms running for 10 years. So whatever is said about the emergency which Mrs. Indira Gandhi kind of put on the country lasted all of less than 2 years. We've had 10 years of a systematic kind of decimation of the media, most of it kind of forced by way of them having lost kind of the plot vis-a-vis the economics or needing government support. But a lot of that has also been voluntary. So I think a lot of the reporting around here has been a product of almost kind of phone calls coming to legacy media, to big newspapers. Television, of course, we know has played a landmark role in even the BJP managing to get 240 seats. And this is the point made by premier kind of psephologist and social scientist Yogendra Yadav, that I think the media, what is referred to contemptuously but rather appropriately as Godi media, that media which is kind of almost lapdog and not watchdog media, which is happy to kind of just sing the same tune as the party in power, has had to do. So a lot of it has been drummed up over the years, systematically trying to almost induce a kind of social change to bat for the BJP. So I think in large parts, all of that, what you said is true. There's been technical problems. There's not so much resources going in for how media covers elections. It's expensive business. Polls are even more expensive. A lot of it is kind of mallified. A lot of it is actually seeing it through a certain set of glasses. And there's incompetence and an inability to really contact the last man on the block, the last woman on the block who's come out and voted in places like UP, which have been tricky. So people have also forgotten kind of the political history and the more recent political history of, say, India's largest state of Uttar Pradesh, which has never been kind of really one-sided. It has been known to throw up surprises. But the assumption was that Mr. Modi and his party have it all stitched up. It's in his pocket. It's the theater for where Ayodhya has been staged, where 2 other kind of so-called contentious temple drives are being mounted by people who believe what the ruling party does. And it's also Mr. Modi's adopted land. He's now an MP from Varanasi and not from Gujarat, which is his home state. So I think getting that wrong has been a kind of but I must say that a lot of people got it right. I don't know what Rajdeep's talking about, because his channel never gave the impression that, that this was going to go anyway, but for like 300 and maximum about 299 for the BJP. But other than that, a lot of people got it right. They may not have come out with numbers really, but in terms of conversation that they reported, discussions that they kind of cited, etc., it was clear that people were kind of seeing the change that was there with the least privileged, the most deprived sections of society, in economic terms and in social terms, coming together to give us this rather spectacular result.
Great. There's all kinds of questions that emerge from that I want to get to, and I'll come back to you, Seema. But just to bring Raghavan into the conversation now. Excellency, you sort of served in Pakistan, I think, in the early parts of the Modi administration. I think it was the first term that you were in Pakistan. And I think where India is today, and I'm keen to talk more about India-Pakistan relations as well, but specifically on India's place in the world, having obviously listened to and heard and of course read, a lot of the positive coverage of the election result and the negative coverage of, the impact of the Modi years, as a maybe not wholly objective sort of bystander, but certainly an outsider, there's little doubt that India's stature on the world stage has grown. Now, I think critics might attribute that to the Indo-Pacific theater and the US-China competition, but surely some of that attribution has to do with India's own economic strength and I would say from an Indian perspective, the wisdom and alacrity with which foreign policy has been managed over the last decade. So within the framework of that sort of key framing, right, does a weaker Modi really mean a stronger India? How do you anticipate a weaker Modi will translate for India's foreign policy posture, for its strategic autonomy vis-a-vis, what we saw in terms of what India did in terms of taking a position or not taking a position on the Russia-Ukraine dynamic, and similarly how it's leveraged to its advantage its importance in the Indo-Pacific. How do you see this sort of taking shape as a weaker Modi takes charge?
But to my mind, we have to take a more longer-term view of this. It is right, it is true that India's international stock has been going up, but this is part of a much longer trend. And while it has gone up in the past 10 years, admittedly, the past 10 years is also part of a longer secular process where India's stature as also acknowledgement of India's achievements by the global community has progressively been increasing. And there are many reasons for this. Partly it is the economic performance. And when we look at economic performance, it's good to look at a quarter century long span. But it is also the fact of democracy, regular elections, and people generally respecting the mandate which has been given. So while, yes, there are tactical shifts in who loses and who does well, but the fact is that that there is a wide acceptance to popular mandates. That has been something which is well established, and that really does say something about India's position in terms of global opinion. I think when we try to relate foreign policy to immediate tactical changes in the domestic situation, there are a number of issues. If you look at the India-Pakistan context in particular, while it is tempting to see India-Pakistan relations in terms of the BJP prism or the past decade prism, in fact, there is a independent dynamic to the relationship which transcends internal political changes. I think what this result will mean for India-Pakistan relations, there's a great deal of analysis and discussion about, but I think certain structural features or structural problems have to be confronted. And one of them is certainly the question of terrorism. I know this sounds like a reading from a script, but it's not. I think we have to acknowledge the centrality which that issue has assumed. The terrorist attack yesterday only underscores how much of a role this particular issue is going to play. It's one elephant in the room which we cannot get away from.
Well, Excellency, it's hardly an elephant. I mean, I think that this is the drum that India has beaten, and in some cases, I think it's done so, for understandable reasons. But the root of terrorism, or that issue that India calls terrorism, is actually its occupation of Kashmir. I want to talk about Kashmir, not just from the perspective of India-Pakistan relations, but in its own right, because I think that's also an element of what the BJP claims to have delivered to its voters, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But before we do that, Suhasini, I just, maybe stepping out and zooming out a little bit more broadly, what I hear Excellency doing is saying, don't attribute or link the election result to the immediate or near-term foreign policy postures or outcomes for India. Would you agree with him, or do you think there are things that are going to happen because of a weakened Modi that will begin to manifest themselves on the foreign policy front relatively soon or immediately?
Well, Mosharraf, and thanks so much for inviting me to speak here. I would say that if the theory is that a government that works in a coalition is essentially indicates anything for India's foreign policy, I humbly disagree, because I think India has had very weak coalitions taking very strong postures, whether it was in 1996, one of the weakest coalitions, I think working on, the Northern Alliance support, for example, in Afghanistan. I think weak coalition governments, as you're putting it, have actually, open talks in the neighborhood, whether it was the composite dialogue with Pakistan or the agreements, path-breaking agreements with both Bangladesh and Nepal. So I'll put that aside. I understand that what you mean is there going to be a shift in India's foreign policy given the election result? I would say not really. I think what we're seeing is Mr. Modi coming out of this election. He's certainly got a lot of lessons to learn, and I think Aakar and Seema have really spelt those lessons out. And I think he is looking to send out a message of continuity. Just this morning, Dr. Jaishankar is back at exactly what he's been doing for the last 5 years, calling on the neighborhood leadership that had been invited for the swearing-in ceremony. I think the neighborhood is definitely an area of concern that they intend to get in front of the challenge and deal more closely with those parts of the neighborhood where there is a comfort zone. Obviously, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Myanmar not invited to the swearing-in, and with Pakistan in particular, despite the fact that cricket teams seem to be able to play a match, and I don't say this to rub it in, Mosharraf, today, but that they were able to play the cricket match in New York, I think is significant. Despite that, though, I think it's clear that for the moment, any step with Pakistan would take a lot more opening up. I should remind you that the Pakistani Prime Minister has not, as of today, one day after the swearing-in, sent that letter of congratulations or even a tweet that we have seen most other leaders in touch with Mr. Modi sending out. So obviously there's a lot of work over there. But I think immediately you'll see the neighborhood. The second place where you'll see foreign policy perhaps playing out is in this idea of balance. If the first term of Mr. Modi was really about getting with the United States and with the Quad and working on the Indo-Pacific strategy, I think post 2019, and more specifically what you referred to post the Ukraine war, what we've seen is India asserting its balance in the world. Even symbolically, if you look at the fact that Prime Minister Modi heads this week to the G7, India has been invited, as it always has for several years, as an outreach partner. So he will be meeting the US president, Britain, France, Italy, Germany, Canada, all at that. And then within a few weeks after that, he will be in Kazakhstan, where I think the Pakistan Prime Minister will be as well, meeting with the Russian President Putin, who's expected to be there, the Chinese President Xi Jinping as well. And of course, India and China have a lot to work out at this point. And so that brings me to my third point in foreign policy, where I think you will see a real renewed vigor, if you like, or at least an attempt to resolve issues. And that will be with the two big powers, US and China. And with China in particular, we are at an impasse. For 4 years, the armies have been at, the 3,500 kilometer LAC, literally ranged against each other. While there have been military talks, and India and China have not shut down high-level engagement in the way India and Pakistan have, what we've seen is essentially no movement until there is a movement on resolving the LAC issue. I assume some kind of détente will be attempted, if not actually realized in the next few weeks.
Fantastic. I want to come back to the question of China. I wrote about this last week myself, and I'm going to test sort of my theories with all four of you. But before we do that, I just wanted to talk a little bit more and maybe start with Aakar on what the election result does mean and what it doesn't mean. Some folks, including myself, are a little bit skeptical about whether the election result suddenly means what is being attributed to it in terms of a step away from extremism or from religious right-wing sort of narratives. the BJP is still the single largest party by a big margin in India. And though it has taken a hit in the heartland and in UP, for example, it's actually gained in some places at the same time. I think, again, not knowing anything about this, I'd love to hear more, Aakar, on your perspective on what gains that the BJP has enjoyed in places like West Bengal mean for the sort of social fabric, particularly from the perspective of people being more attuned to or aligned with religiously assertive identity politics. That's the softest way that I could frame, what the RSS and BJP do. Again, from this perspective, far away. How do you see this dynamic playing out, and what does the election result actually mean?
The long term shows that the BJP will do well across the country. They are very patient. They're very disciplined. They have an ideology which most parties in India don't have. So the BJP is one of the few parties, perhaps the only one, that professes to have an ideology. You could quibble, as I do, that this manifests itself mostly in negative terms, but it does stand for something. And that standing for something is two basic things. One is the persecution of minorities, particularly Muslims. The other is an attack on federalism. So the BJP doesn't have any written text there is no end state in Hindutva, but there are two written texts that it says are important. One is what it calls its official philosophy, which is a set of 4 lectures given in 1965 by a former BJP Janasangh head, Dindayal Upadhyay, where he attacks the idea of states. He doesn't want federalism. He wants a unitary state with a single legislature. So this is part of what the BJP in its constitution, I think Article 3, says is its official philosophy. The other, as you have referred to, and I have spoken about, is with relation to minorities. It will not end. State persecution in India comes in 2 forms. One is that the federal government legislates laws or policies that go after minorities. One example to my mind would be the law on citizenship, which excludes specifically Muslims from claiming citizenship of those people who came to India before the end of December 2014. And there's no real reason given for this. The Constitution of India is flexible enough to allow for this bigotry. Through such things, we have footnotes which let us do things called reasonable classification and reasonable restrictions. So the BJP can actually function within that and continue. The second way of doing it is through the states. And most of the laws that target minorities come through BJP-run states, which are quite a few. So if you look at, say, the ban on hijab in Karnataka, that came in a BJP state, a criminalization of the possession of beef that came first in Maharashtra in 2015, which was then a BJP state, as it still is, and then in Haryana, which was the BJP state, and then the lynchings began, and so on. So losing power or sharing power at the center will not necessarily mean that this will end. The BJP had single-digit vote shares in states like Gujarat through the 50s, 60s, 70s, but they were very determined, very organized, very given to sacrifice, I should say. That they have a genuine cadre. They have people both at the grassroots and in the middle classes willing to chuck up a job in Morgan Stanley and spend 6 months campaigning for the BJP. Not too many other parties have that. In the larger frame, I think, to go back to what Suhasini said, things will not change either. So if we look at, say, Pakistan from the framework of foreign policy, what we want from Pakistan, we have already achieved. So terrorism peaked in India in terms of the fatalities in 2001, when we had 4,000 deaths in Kashmir. After General Mosharraf banned the Lashkar-e-Taiba and the Jaish-e-Mohammed, or said he had banned them, fatalities began to drop every year. So they went down to 3,000, 2,000, 1,000. In the 4 years preceding Mr. Modi's taking office, fatalities were under 200 for the most part. They have gone up slightly, but not by much. The other thing is that the security apparatus in Kashmir believes that having successfully fenced off the LOC, most of the violence is now internal. And then we have that old canard about there's only a limited number of people, and if we get rid of them, this thing will end. Whether I've been hearing that since 1989, so we don't know how long that will continue. But the last point I want to make is that the coalitions in India tend to be transactional and do not, for the most part, associate themselves with ministries like the External Affairs portfolio. So what the BJP has sought to do, if I have understood it right, which is have a sort of transactional foreign policy more than an ethical or moral one, will actually continue.
That's fantastic, and that sets me up for the rest of my sort of questions. I think starting with you, Seema, Aakar just talked about, for example, Maharashtra, and that's an interesting state in terms of what's happened there in this election. And my question is really the same as I asked Aakar. Let me posit a hypothesis, and I'll ask you to react to that. Essentially, the electoral result of the BJP may be whatever it is, but the normalization of hard right-wing Hindutva politics it kind of has a life that is above and beyond the BJP's electoral results. So you have the Shiv Sena sort of as part of the coalition that I think has won Maharashtra, that may have disagreements with the BJP on other issues, but on right-wing sort of positions might be very similar, and that might be the case in several other states as well. That right-wing politics isn't always aligned with just the RSS and the BJP. Is that an oversimplification, and is India sort of out of the woods when it comes to populist right-wing politics?
So I'll just take you, because you brought up Maharashtra and the Shiv Sena. It's really interesting to note that the Shiv Sena, which is now split into two, one which is like a friendly to Modi Shiv Sena, and one which is the other Shiv Sena, which actually involves Bal Thackeray's son. If there's one thing which is his core vote in Maharashtra today, it's the Muslim vote. It's the Muslim vote because Uddhav Thackeray, as Chief Minister of Maharashtra, actually had a chance to kind of demonstrate what he stood for. And during COVID, etc., he's gathered enormous goodwill. And you could maybe call it a version of, partly Stockholm syndrome, that the memories of Shiv Sena from the 90s were such that when his son, the much more genial, soft-spoken Uddhav Thackeray, assumes office, there was nothing happening like that to encourage either attacks on Muslims, etc., etc. So among his most loyal voters are now the Muslims of Maharashtra, who are also very politically astute and bold. So I think, of course, there's a spillover. It's not only the BJP's kind of propriety to kind of do these attacks, etc., and anti-Muslim stuff sort of bleeding into society, if you like. But I think who's in office makes a lot of difference. Sayya bhai kotwal ab kahe ka dar. The Hindi saying that because somebody whose personal CV, who stands for certain things, a certain view of Hindutva, who personifies a certain kind of, who characterizes it himself or herself, makes a lot of difference to how the state is perceived and how people kind of try and imitate that CV. So I think there, a dent in Mr. Modi's personal popularity is hugely important, and we must not undermine that. We must not I think, this is where I disagree with Aakar, that I don't think it should be taken lightly. We're looking at a scenario where exit polls were talking about 350 to 400 seats. You see, you have to look at it in terms of what the plan that Mr. Modi has. He has plans for a 1,000-year scheme, which is much more of the same thing, which is what he's trying to do. And with newspapers going on, calling it Modi 3.0, which is so insane. This is not Modi 3.0. This may be Modi 2.40 maybe. It's not Modi 3.0. And we must recognize those changes. And I just want to respond to two things. I want to just chime in with what Suhasini said about coalitions. And India is a social coalition. It's nothing if it's not a social coalition. And if our politics is not going to reflect that very explicitly, India loses. If India loses, I think the neighborhood loses and the world loses, because all this, the most populous nation in the world, etc. So I think we should recognize coalitions for the romance that they bring to India and for the truth of India that they reflect in governance. And that's important. If I see somebody like me, if I see somebody from my state speaking my language, who's in power and in government, that makes a lot of difference to the general kind of social fabric and the sense of how India kind of feels and responds and all that. And I also want to sorry if I'm mixing things up, but in this whole Modi coming down to 240 seats, there are many aspects to what Modi's tenure or the BJP's tenure in the past 10 years stood for. One of which is, of course, ideological. Number two is the style, the very dictatorial kind of very, this centralized authoritarian thing. And third is almost bordering on the cult. So that, see, all of these mixed had a kind of they were pushing up the BJP. What you're saying is the Hindu right vote was being pushed up. A lot of these voters weren't coming because they, wanted to go and just start, beating up Muslims and Christians with a baseball bat. It may have ended up like that in empowering those forces. But a lot of people came for reasons of Mr. Modi, of thinking that he'll bring achhe din or good days. With all of that getting eroded, the ideology also gets hit. And I don't think that there's ever an end game where we can say either whether it's the Muslim right or the Buddhist right or the Hindu right can all, it's like a continuous struggle. Our whole lives are going to be spent in just doing this, in kind of pushing back and getting more space. So I see it like a plus in that. And the final point I want to make here in this part is that the economy, the way Mr. Modi conceptualized and boasted that he'll kind of give free rations to 800 million and they'll come to me and shut it down. That's the end of the inequality. And by the way, he never saw much wrong with inequality either. And I'm going to shut it down. Having these very favorite cronies in part, that's got pushed back. So, that's part of the reason of the result. And the result should jolly well be interpreted as calling for a more inclusive economics. So I think all of this combined makes for an India that's breathing a little more O2, which can start talking about a little more sensible things. And of course, Mr. Modi will try and make it like it's Modi 3.0, it's Modi 100,000-year Reich. But I think it's for us to kind of see what's really happened as people have voted and how this is to be seen to make it work for India, the region, and the world.
Can I just quickly, before I go to Raghavan, just quickly follow up on one of the aspects that you just spoke about, that I think, at least from some of the friends that have been very excited about India's economic trajectory over the last decade, that they see what you kind of framed as almost this romantic view of India as a social coalition. They see that as being, a political anchor. And an economic anchor that has slowed down India's growth. I mean, there's references to the so-called Hindu rate of growth or the India rate of growth, that's 3% per annum. The new baseline in India is 6%. And I take the point that a couple of you made that, a lot of the baseline for this, I think Raghavan said this as well, was set prior to Modi. So for example, the digital stack in India, it's easy for the BJP to take credit for, Aadhaar and the whole thing. But actually, even I know, for example, that, Nandan, Nilekani, and it was under the Congress government that a lot of the baselines for that were put in place. So notwithstanding the baselines, there is a genuine concern that the markets will have. And I think, especially in the West, people that have been excited about sort of hyper growth in India will have, that has to do with the social coalition once again becoming a burden or like an obstacle to rapid economic growth, which is something that especially India's Western partners expect and hope to see in India.
Are you asking me, Mosharraf, or Raghavan?
Yes, Seema, I was asking you.
Okay. No, yeah. So I think on the economics, and I think Aakar has a great book. I should plug that now. The Price of the Modi Years. So I think this whole economy kind of being in rockstar mode in the past 10 years is mythology. The GDP numbers are the serious question. And if there's any period that we have that India has witnessed after the initial kind of building blocks that Nehru, India's first prime minister, put in place, have been the 10 years where you had the biggest coalition that India has had in this millennium, where you have Dr. Manmohan Singh, and that's the max. So in fact, I think they keep trying to doctor the numbers in the next 10 years to kind of do the hype and to somehow match it. So I don't buy that. And on very economic terms, if India is at all going to be this kind of grand partner or this great economic powerhouse, it's not going to come because of Ambani and Adani doing pre weddings and a million cruises. It's going to come because of growth and demand. And for demand, you need the poor people to buy. So even if I give somebody lots of money, he's going to buy one very fancy car and not going to consume consume more. You have to have the millions of Indians consuming and being in a position to consume that to sustain their growth. So I think if anybody, whether it's Unilever or any of the big companies, if they know their stuff, they do a lot of rural marketing. They've been putting this up because they don't want to say this to Mr. Modi, but they know very clearly that this kind of jobless growth, etc., is going to lead India into a dark alley, which will be very difficult to reverse out of. So I think whether it's a social coalition in terms of societal impulses, etc., even by way of the economy, it's going to be all your consumers that are going to aggregate and provide that demand aggregation for people to come and sell their wares too. So I think this more serious of the multinationals and the countries and the other countries who see India as a market and as reliable would be interested in the masses doing well, which kind of is a complete counter in the whole inequality thing. With Ambani and Adani jetting off is doing nothing to Ramlal and Sheikh Moinuddin in some backwater. They're the ones who are going to pull up the economy in the longer term. So I think that they're misplaced if foreign people just look at just the few thousand companies listed at the Bombay Stock Exchange as the only barometer, and that as the only way of seeing the Indian economy. That would be my view.
That's a perfect segue for what I wanted to ask, Excellency. One of the relationships that I think is least understood by even I think by keen observers of India is the India-China relationship. And I want to talk a little bit about that, I'll ask everyone, but really I want you to begin with this, just to present a couple of data points, because, this mythology part of the economic story that Seema has just referred to, it really kind of pops out in the numbers in terms of trade with China, for example. We hear a lot about how India is putting up a strong fight with China and, beginning to align with the Quad in the Indo-Pacific, and India is going to stand by the West in the South China Sea and on Taiwan, and China dare not do anything akin to what India's been doing in Kashmir. But when you look at the numbers tell a totally different story. I'm just going to read these because I don't want to get them wrong, but India's imports from China were $54 billion worth in 2014. That in and of itself is not a small number, but they've more than doubled in the Modi era, from 54 billion to almost 120 billion. That's a massive increase. And concurrently, the exports from India to China have only grown, they've grown very little. I think they went from about 16 billion in 2014 to just a smidge under 19 billion last year. So this massive trade deficit, all the while that India is supposedly fighting for the Galwan Heights and winning back India's honor in the Himalayas, in terms of the trade deficit, there's a massive gap between India and China. Now, that gap, I think, exists militarily and in terms of military spending and in other areas. So part of the myth of this kind of rapidly growing India falls apart when it comes to India's competition or, I guess, disagreements with China. How do you see that playing out? Am I being overly pro-China as a Pakistani is want to be? Or is there any serious discussion in India that aligns with these numbers and that suggests that perhaps India is not yet at a place where it can take China on in the way that sometimes I think, especially for Western audiences, Indian strategists tend to pretend? I heard C. Raja Mohan the other day go on this hour-and-a-half long lecture about India versus China that had almost nothing to do with some of these data points. Raghavan? Oh, we really want to hear you, and you're muted, so you'll have to start again, unmute and start again.
What you're quite simply saying is that asymmetry, when you look at the different economic and military indices between India and China. That goes without saying. But I don't think the rest of it necessarily follows. The India-China trade deficit and the growing India-China trade numbers cannot be seen simply in an India-China context alone. This is something which China has a similar situation with the rest of the world. The Chinese economy has in the past 25 years become a major player in terms of providing goods to the global economy. Now, this has led to a certain dependence in India, but that dependence is also part of a much wider global program or global process. It's not just an India-China issue. But does that necessarily mean that where it comes to dealing with China, we have no options at all? No, I don't think so. I think while there is a certain amount of overblown rhetoric with regard to the India-China standoff, the fact is that we have faced a very significant Chinese assertion of military power on the line of actual control, and to a great extent we have withstood it. Now there are different views about how strongly we should have withstood it, but that's not the point. But the point is that you face a major pressure on your entire line of actual control or the entire continental border with China, while at the same time you have to manage a very, very important economic relationship, because certainly dependencies have emerged in the Indian economy. And while one can talk about the trade deficit, the fact is we get a large number of goods from China cheaper than we would have got them from somewhere else. So how do you balance the political or the military and the economic issues? That really is the challenge which you face in terms of your diplomacy. I would tend to agree with what Suhasini said earlier, that the standoff phase over the past 4 years will probably now change a little bit with the new government. How precisely it will change, one doesn't know. But that you have to manage this economic, the economic and the military situation simultaneously, I think that is inescapable. I think it's very easy to, scoff at India trying to stand up to China when it has this huge economic relationship with it. But that is the nature of the beast in today's world. And it's not just a situation which India confronts, but many other countries confront simultaneously. I think it's simplistic to try to reduce it to a binary choice and that you have to take a stand on one side of the divide. It doesn't work like that. You have to manage both sides of the equation. And I would think the challenge before us in the next 3 or 4 years was how do we shift from the current standoff situation to something which will be a little more relaxed.
I would just for the sake of addressing the Pakistan aspect of this dynamic of India's place in the world and in the region, I would just repeat what you just said and put Pakistan in India's place and put India in China's place. And I think that, a lot of the similar sort of principles about, not scoffing at and not allowing a asymmetry economically and politically to cause us to be blind to the legitimacy of the smaller and weaker countries' concerns vis-a-vis, for example, Kashmir, but also the ability of that smaller country to withstand the kind of economic and military pressures that a hugely asymmetric advantage to the adversary, in this case India, might entail. But I think there's a different sort of forum and a different conversation where we can have that. But I just thought it was perfect how you framed that in explaining India's position vis-a-vis China. And I think a lot of that applies. Again, there's not any perfect isomorphs, but a lot of those principles I think apply in terms of understanding Pakistan's desire to, for example, cling to the notion that what's been done in Kashmir in 2019 requires to be addressed in some ways, and that it isn't just an internal matter for India. I want to go down that rabbit hole as well.
I would say that, that analogy has its limitations. The big difference in the India-China and the India-Pakistan comparison is the regression which has taken place in Pakistan in domestic terms in the last 10 years, in terms of its economic capacities and in terms of its political harmony. I think that has led to contributed greatly to the existing asymmetries, not just with India, but also in the manner in which Pakistan interfaces with other countries. I think that is one big difference. The second is that, and this is more fundamental, that in the India-China context, India is by and large a status quoist. It doesn't want to meddle around or doesn't want to major changes on the line of actual control. We were quite happy with the balance which had been struck in the mid 1990s, that let's try to develop the rest of the relationship, and the line of actual control of the border we can attend to in due course. But let's try to build the rest of our relationship. In the India-Pakistan context, the Pakistanis are not status quo. They are revisionists. At every opportunity and by every means available, they will try to change the status quo to their advantage. And this is what has led to the major turbulence in the India-Pakistan relationship over the past 20 years. That the reason for these massive ups and downs is this essentially revisionist approach of Pakistan, which destabilizes the relationship, notwithstanding important initiatives which are taken by both the Pakistani and the Indian leadership at different points of time. So I think, while that analogy has a certain appeal, it also has its limitations.
Well, no doubt there are limitations, and like I said, I think there's a risk that we sort of rabbit hole into this too far. Just on the revisionism, of course, many Pakistanis, whether that's technically accurate from an Indian perspective or not, would counter argue that actually India's occupation of Kashmir is the ultimate revision, and that's, until that isn't addressed, it'll be hard to address anything else. I want to talk more about this, of course, and maybe just in this conversation, but maybe in a future conversation as well. But Suhasini, on the China question, if I link what Seema said about growth at the bottom of the pyramid and making sure that India's poorest citizens have purchasing power, and I link that with what Raghavan said about the acknowledgement of this massive gap, trade deficit, not just trade deficit, but other deficits between India and China, it would seem that what you had alluded to earlier makes the most sense, that actually some sort of an accommodation or a get along, go along policy with China that allows Indian citizens to continue to consume, efficiently and at its cheapest, without India conceding any of the key issues that it wants to concede. How do you think Modi so-called 3.0 is going to thread the needle on this? Because part of this will require walking back some of the kind of 56-inch chest thumping that perhaps his regime in the last decade has gotten used to. And in particular, if you could go into a little bit more sophistication in terms of explaining it to me and to viewers, how will that be managed vis-a-vis the West? Will it just be a frontal sort of, talk to the hand when it comes to pressures from the US in particular, but I think also from Australia and Japan? Or will there be kind of public expressions of, assertiveness towards China and boardroom kind of concessions to China? Like, how is this actually going to take place if indeed there will be kind of a let up in some of the tension with China? So, Suhasini, I'll just ask you to unmute before you speak. Thanks.
The last part of your question, Mosharraf, is easily answered, because it is the US, it is Europe, it is Australia, it is Japan even. If you look at the trilateral meeting Japan held along with Korea, who are re-engaging with China now. So I don't think they have a leg to stand on if they were to ask India what India is doing in trying to resolve these issues. Look, my analysis of why this government will go ahead to try to change things with China is based on what Prime Minister Modi has said. Out of all the 80 plus interviews he gave in the run-up to the elections, I think one of the most significant ones had a quote on China, I think that he gave the Newsweek magazine, where he said three things. He did not, very unlike what his ministers have been saying for the last few years. Mr. Modi did not criticize China or hold China solely responsible for the situation at the LAC. Very important, given that most in India who look at the situation see this as Chinese transgression in 2020 into Indian territory. Despite that, Mr. Modi has gone to great pains, even at the risk of ridicule within the Indian polity, to say no one has entered Indian territory, no Chinese soldiers came and took any territory away from India since 2020, virtually, validating China's own position that they have not moved into any Indian territory. What he said in this interview was that it's a very concerning situation with China, that he is very concerned about the situation with China. He said that he would like to see an early resolution to the situation at the LAC. And he said that the India-China relationship, it remains a very, very important relationship. I think that's something Prime Minister Modi has continuously, a message he has sent. If you remember, before 2020, he met one-on-one with President Xi Jinping no less than 18 times. He's met 2 times subsequently, really on the sidelines of multilateral meetings. So it remains to be seen whether there will be some kind of a meeting at the SCO in Astana. Why does India have this kind of relationship with China? I think the problem is threefold. The one is the bilateral relationship between India and China. And you pointed out there's a very, very close trade relationship. India is not the only one. Look at countries like the US that can't seem to, despite all their protectionist new laws, can't seem to disengage. Europe, that has brought it down to something called de-risking rather than decoupling, but has not been able to make that push, simply because China built itself as this manufacturing base. India faced the same. While it certainly faced a lot of supply chain resilience problems from China during the COVID pandemic, the fact remains that India is also dependent. If India is the pharmacy to the world, then 70% of the APIs, the advanced pharmaceutical ingredients, come from China. When it comes to electric vehicles and the future of India's big renewable energy push, where is a lot of those silicon chips coming from? So I think, and solar voltaic cells as well, that India needs. So that's one real issue. I think the second is China's considerable presence in India's neighborhood and how to deal with that without necessarily throwing the baby out with the bathwater. If neighbors are progressing due to assistance from Chinese development funds, then how India has to engage with that situation and perhaps try to offer more sustainable, more transparent alternatives to the neighborhood. And finally, there's that situation in the Indo-Pacific, where so much of India's trade does go through. If there's going to be a problem along the Malacca Straits or in the South China Sea, that's something that's going to affect India as well. So those are all the sensible reasons why this government does want to continue to engage with China, despite the very real threat that China poses to India today. I think the economic point that Seema made was important. And I think that's where this new government, and I agree with Seema, you can't call this Modi 3.0 anymore. This is a new government entirely. He himself is referring it now to as the NDA government. And saying that this is the National Democratic Alliance government. It is a coalition he has to learn to deal with. I think that's one of the messages that has come from this vote as well, along with perhaps the pushback against the authoritarianism, against the all-present, constant reminder of one leader rather than many leaders. I think there is definitely a push against majoritarianism. In Ayodhya for the BJP to lose, in all of the places where he made speeches which were which looked purely communal, for him to have lost despite making those very, very strong speeches there. I think there's no question that there is a vote against majoritarianism there. I think there is a push really to keep India's the framework of India's constitution, because the pushback was against giving the previous government a 400-seat supermajority that would allow them to change that constitution. And I think there's certainly all of these messages, but the most important one perhaps is the economic one, that you can't keep making emotional pitches and forget what the economy means for Indians by and large. And I think that's where you're going to see much more groundwork being done. Prime Minister Modi has now made his first policy decision this morning, and it is for the farmers. I think that's a real sign to say message received as far as Prime Minister Modi is concerned about the kind of economic distress that has led to this complete loss in his majority at the top, something that he will continue to have to engage with. The idea that jobless development has become a real problem. You can keep touting GDP growth numbers. You can keep talking about India's position in the world, courtesy its massive market, its massive population. But as long as that is a jobless growth, it's not really helping, and that distress is going to show up. The future challenges of climate change, migrations, artificial intelligence, and I know this is not what we're discussing today, those are going to put more pressure in the immediate future. So I think if India is to mount, I wouldn't say a challenge to China, but it's certainly a pushback to not just China, but the way China does things. In other words, the way China believes that a one-party, authoritarian, non-pluralistic regime goes ahead. If India is to be the counter to that, and that's what you were asking about, where the world sees India's relationship with China. If India is to be that that counter, it has to be democratic, it has to be pluralistic, and it has to be rule-abiding.
That's a great segue. Aakar, what does that then mean for the kind of Hindutva agenda, which, again, with 200 plus seats, the BJP still owes its dedicated sort of core supporters, its base, so to speak, at least some of, fulfillment of some of the promises. When it comes to the questions like the renaming of Bharat to Bharat, or the renaming of India to Bharat, when it comes to claims about retaking, so to speak, what some Indians call Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, or references being made to parts of Pakistan that are contiguous to India and China, like Gilgit. What are those to be ignored, as many of my Indian friends keep asking me to, as merely electoral rhetoric that just belongs in the election cycle? Or is there, because of this electoral result, is the threat of fulfilling those threats diminished? Or because Modi's weaker, is the incentive for Modi to actually double down and try and externalize some of the conflict and kind of bring India together by engaging in some sort of an external all India come together? How do you see that agenda and how it plays out, particularly with respect to Pakistan, but even independent of Pakistan? Aakar?
There is no doubt that the addition of allies from the south especially will add an element of sobriety to what the union government does in India. But that is not to say that the BJP is absolutely batshit crazy and wants to launch war without any kind of thinking behind it. In fact, I would say that one of the problems many of us have had with the BJP is the non-serious attitude to national security. So we don't have a national security doctrine. There was a defense planning committee formed 5 years ago. It hasn't written it up yet. It's a lot of it unfolds from reaction. And for a nationalism-minded party, that is slightly weak. On the larger question of whether it, as a institution, will continue the persecution that it seeks to achieve, yes, the BJP is genuinely ideological. They believe in it. There might be elements in it today who are pragmatic, who are opportunistic, and there always have been. In 1980, Mr. Vajpayee expanded the party, renamed it, and the one big change was that people who were not from the RSS could hold an office in it. And that has brought in people with it. But for the core of it remains a party that is ideologically aligned to the idea of a Hindu India, The problem there is that they don't know where to take it. Nepal was the only Hindu Rashtra till 2008, but the only Hindu elements it had were a Kshatriya king, the Kshetri dynasty, from whom all of the executive power flowed. And in the court of this king, they had a Brahmin who was titled the Mool Purohit, who would guide the king in how to go about ruling. We don't even have those. We don't have a hereditary Kshatriya king that can take us to a kind of Hindu state. I suspect that we are doing to ourselves what Pakistan did in the early period. That after Liaquat said what he did in the Constituent Assembly, we had a phase where Pakistan tried to Islamize, but it couldn't in the way that Iran could because of the difference between Shiism and Sunnism. Sunnis don't have the kind of ideological framework, the clerical framework to be able to impose theocracy. India has the same problem. We don't have a set of texts which tell us that this is what Hindu rule means. My community, in Smriti terms, we are Shudra. We are Savarna, the lowest part of the Smritis don't give us the right to read or write and so on. You can't do that in the world of 2024 as a signatory to the human right, to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and so on. What remains will be the persecutive elements, that you pass law and policy on bulldozing a property owned by Muslims, collective punishment. That will not go away. Wherever the BJP is in power, it will continue doing this for two reasons. One is, as I said, it is ideologically true and pure as a party. The other is that there is benefit to it. The BJP is the most popular party in this country today. Mr. Modi is the most popular leader in this country today. Despite the fact, or perhaps because of the fact, that they have done what they have done in the 10 years in Delhi and what he has done in the 12 years in Gujarat. And I think that to expect that that will suddenly shift because there is a coalition at the union, to my mind, is wrong.
That's quite sobering, Aakar. Seema, are you sort of is your prognosis as at some level dark as Aakar's in terms of the continuity and the continuability of the right-wing agenda domestically? And do you see any of that seeping into external affairs? Seema, you'll just unmute before you speak, please.
Apologies. Sorry. Yeah. No, so, I mean, of course, I agree with Aakar that the BJP is not going to give up. They are ideological. They need to be respected for that. There's enough evidence in the laboratory for that commitment. We've seen that. The RSS is going to mark its 100th year in 2025. And it's, they would say it's a big success. But I don't think that there's anything. What this has kind of destroyed is the belief that was coming in India and outside, a despondency that maybe India is also set to be on the same path as its neighbors, and in the kind of, I don't want to use the word cesspool, I won't use it, though I've just done it just now, but in what South Asia was meant to be its default options of being just ethnic nationalism of various types. We're quite alike, but you have like a Buddhist version, you have a Sunni Muslim version, you have a Hindu version, a Brahminical version, and you have like that kind of thing. So I think India kind of provided a path for being exceptional, not because we're full of exceptional people, no, but it was setting its goals higher. It kind of just 5 years at the close of World War II, having seen so much of European nationalism prevail, it steps out and defines an Indian nationhood. Now, all of those kind of high-minded ideals seem to be at risk because of what happened in 10 years. This is not to say that things were going swimmingly before that, but at least people were, the ruling parties or leaders were hypocritical. And I love hypocrisy because they were at least paying homage to the right ideals. What happened later was a sneaking suspicion that are we going to kind of step back from the right to equality, which is what the Indian constitution gives us. It's not as if India is fundamentally equal. It's not. We have practiced the best kind of graded inequality system and perfected it into a social art. But the fact that the constitution came into play so much in this election, and it was actually a voting point. So people who are like very skeptical, who thought that, it's just these liberals and so on, who are worried about right to equality and right to protest, these are all fringe issues, that has been actually shown up this time. So for me, while all that Aakar is saying is of course correct that they're doing that, but it's like meeting pushback. And if we look at in terms of, though I think Mr. Modi is no garden variety populist, it's like a different kind of kettle of fish which we have here. But if you look at Erdogan and you look at Orban, you see attempts by opposition getting together and through electoral politics trying to push them out, push these leaders out. They've really not managed. They've not managed to bring the majority down. But in India, we did, right? So there's something right here is all I'm saying. So maybe it's a bit like the glass half full and half empty thing between Aakar and me. But I think more than kind of optimism, we must see what we are, which we would not have said had the BJP got 304 seats, 305 seats. All I'm saying is we must recognize that it's got pushback, and on those reasons alone. So a lot of it has been very pragmatic pushback, and for a whole lot of other reasons that the BJP has got pushed out. But I think the fact that all those other elements which are kind of boulders and kind of roadblocks in the path of untrammeled ethnic nationalism, that lives on. And for me, that gives me immense hope. It gives me clarity on the path forward. And of course, the path forward is full of sleepless nights and struggle, but it gives me a road out of it. It gives me a way.
Fantastic. Let me just take that pushback point and pause it or ask Raghavan whether that pushback applies to some of the rhetoric that I'd referred to earlier that we heard during the campaign trail, especially as it relates to Pakistan and territorial, what a Pakistani would call territorial revisionism, and without reopening that debate, but the idea of so-called POK or Gilgit-Baltistan and this kind of aggressive, assertive India. Is the pushback just restricted to domestic politics, or will there be a more sober version of Jaishankar and Doval and Prime Minister Modi? And then by the same token, does that pushback, how far does that pushback go? Is there any chance of India revisiting its approach to Srinagar in particular, but Kashmir at large?
You see, where India-Pakistan relations are concerned, the issue is not a BJP factor. There is as you know, there is a longer history. And in fact, where India-Pakistan relations are concerned, notwithstanding sharp differences domestically, there is, I think, a greater consensus within the country on that issue than they are on the numerous other issues which were mentioned by Seema and Aakar. So I think on Pakistan, you will find that the differences between different political parties is much less than there are on other domestic issues. So so when you say, for instance, the use of inflammatory rhetoric on Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, that we will take it back, I think the point to remember is that such rhetoric is fueled not so much by a military or a diplomatic logic, but it is meant to create a counter narrative to one which has been internalized in Pakistan for many years and which has become a major stumbling block. And that narrative in Pakistan is Kashmir banega Pakistan. So this is a kind of equivalent narrative which is being constructed, and the attempt is to normalize it. Just like you have normalized Kashmir banega Pakistan in Pakistan, the effort is to normalize this at the narrative level in India.
I just want you to have a chance to clarify, Raghavan, because as a Pakistani, knowing that Nara, Kashmir banega Pakistan, reverberates in Srinagar more than anywhere else, I hope you're not referring to Srinagar as Pakistan.
No, I'm referring to Pakistan as Pakistan.
Okay.
But I think you have internalized that narrative, and you don't like that narrative being questioned by a counter narrative in India. But I think where India-Pakistan relations are concerned, there are far more serious issues than these narrative positions which are being taken now and which have been taken continuously in the past. I think despite this battle of narratives and the polemical dust, there are the fact is that both India and Pakistan have issues which have to be addressed in all seriousness, away perhaps from the glare of publicity. I am somewhat of an optimist, and this election result makes me a little more optimist. I think the kind of situation which has existed for the past 6 to 7 years. Perhaps we will see it loosening up further. I think there will be certain steps which are taken by both sides, which will lead to a improvement in bilateral relations, which is not to say that the narrative issues or the political differences will be completely forgotten. They will be used to adopt polemical positions, but in substance, that there will be efforts to resolve, at least move forward on day-to-day issues. That is something I think which is very much possible, and it is something which should be worked towards.
Well, that's quite brilliant. Optimism is, I think, especially here in Pakistan, we're looking for optimism any which way we can get it. So that's very encouraging. So, Suhasini, do you share that optimism? I mean, kind of, what's your take on the potential poisoning of the electoral rhetoric to the governance space as it relates to foreign policy, but specifically with respect to Kashmir and Pakistan? Just unmute before you start speaking. Thanks.
I think, Mosharraf, that this is not just something to consider from the new government in India point of view, but also from the new government in Pakistan point of view, which is only a few months old. The fact is that if, India has, perhaps the government has straightened or narrowed some of its abilities by this electoral rhetoric that you refer to on taking back land and all of that. I think Pakistan's government is also slightly straightened by the idea that they can't move forward with India unless there's a complete reversal to the reorganization of Jammu and Kashmir from 2019. Now, we can get into a separate argument about whether the reorganization of a state from internal point of view actually changes anything for Pakistan, or whether, in fact, the changing of a constitutional amendment that Pakistan had never in the past recognized is again something that Pakistan should mourn the loss of. Or whether Pakistan hasn't in fact carried out certain reorganization in that part of Kashmir that Pakistan administers. So we could get into all of those debates. I think the larger question has to be asked about, do Mr. Sharif, who is the Prime Minister of Pakistan now, and Mr. Modi, who's once again the Prime Minister of India, do they intend to go forward on the relationship between the two, or do they intend to stay with the status for the foreseeable future? If they decide to go with status quo, frankly, nothing is really changing on a dime. Over time, there will be, there will be a pushback, or there will be certainly the downside of not allowing South Asia to develop or progress together. In the short term, both can continue without acknowledging each other. As I said, the Pakistani Prime Minister hasn't yet even wished Mr. Modi on his taking charge as Prime Minister again. On the other hand, we have in the last few years seen a very curious kind of a phenomenon between India and Pakistan, where the leaders, the people who have been elected by their people, don't actually have any conversations. They don't front any kind of détente between them. But those who are unelected are actually speaking to each other. Clearly, when the line of control ceasefire was brought into place in 2021, at a time when India was having a fairly tough time at the LAC with China, that was something that was negotiated without anyone really asking about it. The Kartarpur corridor, which has continued despite so much tension. In fact, it was inaugurated only a few months after the changes in Jammu and Kashmir. And we have seen the two countries avert what could have been a really bad situation with a missile misfire that went out of India into Pakistan without necessarily making it part of this kind of rhetoric that you were referring to. So I think the two countries have the means. The two prime ministers certainly know, if they want to go forward, how they can go forward. They have to decide whether they want to go the public way, which would be to first restore the high commissioners of the two countries. Second, to start talking about trade again, which in 2019, between India's new tariffs and Pakistan's decision to cancel all trade between the two countries, is completely at an end. Maybe they can even talk about that old idea of the transit trade, which India and Pakistan were able to make some movement on in a one way when Pakistan allowed India to send aid to Afghanistan. So these are all ideas out there. These are not fanciful ideas, because they have actually been worked out on the ground in the last few years while the two countries weren't officially speaking to each other. Whether that will happen or not, whether they will take advantage of what is the low-hanging fruit, plus the fact that they've only just come into power, so they do have a little bit of wind behind their sails if they want to take risks, that remains to be seen. I certainly think that it would be a missed opportunity if they want to.
Suhasini, I think, no better note than to identify pathways of opportunity. My own position on this is a little bit different, and I think I personally have hardened a little bit on the availability of pathways to conversations with friends in India. But with this election result and with this kind of a conversation, I think, maybe some of those pathways can melt and open up again. Certainly, it would be remiss of me if I don't mention that, the treatment of Kashmir by India remains, and I've mentioned this earlier, remains the principal stumbling block. Again, personally for me, I'm not at liberty to speak about the governments. And I know that there are plenty of people in India that have maintained a critique of the way in which those things have been managed by your country. So I think with this hope for pathways and opportunities opening up, and with a profound thanks to Aakar, Patel, Seema, Chishti, DCA Raghavan, and Suhasini, Haidar, for an enlightening and really illuminating conversation. At least for me, I hope our viewers felt the same way. Anyone want to sort of chip in with any final thoughts? The floor is yours.
I have a question. May I?
Of course.
Mosharraf, what is it? Is this Tabadlab or is it Tabadlab? The name of your group?
It's Tabadlab.
Tabadlab. So it's not Tabadlab. You don't want like now. It's Tabadlab.
Actually, I'd never thought of it that way, but this is part of the benefit of engaging across the border. We have linguistic depth in a way that perhaps we wouldn't across other borders. The name is a mixture of Tabadla, which is exchange, which is what we're doing. We're doing a Tabadla Khayal and a Tabadla positions, I suppose, when Raghavan is speaking. And lab is where we do experiments. And of course, our whole region, this entire subcontinental region, is a petri dish of many experiments, good and bad. So Tabadlab is kind of a crystallization of our desire to exchange ideas and thoughts, our desire to experiment with how problems can be solved. And I hope this, as a policy conversation, goes, at least in some ways, inches towards better clarity and better answers. Thank you for asking that question, Seema. And thanks once again, Aakar, Seema, DCA Raghavan, and Suhasini, Haidar. I hope we'll all come back and talk more about some of these issues, including in particular India-China relations. Hope you'll join us again very soon. Thanks again. Khuda Hafiz. Bye.